Kill the fat one. The crowd chanted, laughing as a desperate widow was pushed onto the auction block. Men jeered, coins clinked, and the sheriff smirked, ready to sell her off for a single dirty dollar. But then, a silent mountain man stepped forward, and in front of everyone, he did the unthinkable. He paid triple the price to save her life. What looked like a simple act of mercy soon lit a fire no one expected. Because this woman wasn't just poor, she carried a hidden deed to a valley worth more than gold. Now railroad barons, corrupt lawmen, and hired guns will stop at nothing to take it from her. And the mountain man who saved her must face a choice: walk away or risk everything to defend her honor. Will their courage and faith be enough to stand against the power of greed? Or will the frontier swallow them whole before the truth comes to light? This channel isn't just about stories, it's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The noon sun beat down mercilessly on Blackthorn's main street, where wagon wheels churned dust into the hot air. The usual Saturday bustle had taken on a cruel edge as townsfolk pressed toward the wooden platform erected outside the general store. Their faces showed a mix of morbid curiosity and mean-spirited anticipation for what they called the wife auction. Mila Jane stumbled as rough hands pushed her onto the platform. Her worn calico dress hung loose on her heavy frame, and her fingers clutched at the frayed shawl around her shoulders. Sweat trickled down her neck, but it wasn't just the heat that made her tremble. Sheriff Calloway strutted across the platform, twirling his mustache with undisguised glee. "Well, folks, seems we got ourselves a fine specimen today." His words dripped with mockery. "One widow, hardly used. Comes with a mess of debt and," he paused for effect, eyeing Mila's figure, "plenty to love." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Mila's cheeks burned red, but she held her head high, just as her mama had taught her. The jeers grew louder, echoing off the false front buildings. "Kill the fat one," someone shouted from the back, triggering more savage laughter. A drunken rancher, swaying on his feet, raised a grimy hand. $1. He slurred, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty street. Sheriff Calloway's gavel hovered in the air. $1 bid, do I hear two? His eyes gleamed with malice. Going once. $15. The deep voice cut through the noise like a knife. The crowd parted, revealing a tall figure at the back. Stephen Boone stood straight-backed, his buckskins dusty from the trail, a bundle of pelts still slung over his shoulder. His face was shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. The sheriff's smile faltered. 15? Now hold on, you heard me. Stephen's boots thudded on the wooden steps as he climbed onto the platform. Triple the going rate for a proper marriage contract. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Even the drunken rancher stopped swaying to stare. Sheriff Calloway's face twisted with displeasure, but the law was clear. He couldn't refuse a legitimate bid. Fine, the sheriff spat. $15 bid. Going once, going twice. He brought the gavel down with unnecessary force. Sold to the mountain man. Stephen counted out the coins carefully, then turned to Mila. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Without a word, he offered his arm, helping her down from the platform with unexpected gentleness. The crowd began to disperse, muttering and casting dark looks their way. Some lingered to watch as Stephen led Mila to his cart, where two patient mules stood waiting. The afternoon sun was beginning to soften when he finished securing his trade goods and prepared to leave town. Mila gathered her courage, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do that, Mr. Boone? Why help someone like me?" Stephen paused in his work, his weathered hands still on the leather straps. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw the depth of compassion in his eyes. "Because it was wrong," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, her fingers trembling as they gripped the rough boards. The mule's harnesses jingled as Stephen climbed up beside her. Behind them, a few remaining onlookers shouted final insults, but their words were lost in the creak of wagon wheels as Stephen clucked to the mules. They rolled out of Blackthorn, leaving the dust and cruelty behind. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the rutted road, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. Mila sat straight back beside the mountain man who had saved her, her heart pounding with uncertainty about what lay ahead, but grateful to be leaving the mockery behind. The wagon wheels turned steadily, taking them away from the town that had shown her nothing but scorn. Stephen's quiet strength beside her felt like a shield against the world's cruelty, though neither of them yet knew what tomorrow might bring. The mule cart creaked steadily along the rutted trail as dusk painted the western hills in shades of crimson. The sun's dying rays caught the dust their wheels stirred up, turning it to floating copper in the evening air. Mila sat rigidly beside Stephen, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Though no tears fell, her throat ached with the effort of holding them back. The shame of the afternoon's events pressed down on her like a physical weight. Every cruel laugh, every mocking jeer echoed in her memory. She stole quick glances at the mountain man beside her, still struggling to believe what he'd done. When they reached a clear-running creek lined with cottonwoods, Stephen drew the mules to a halt. "Need to water them," he said, his voice rough. "From disuse." The animals' hooves crunched on gravel as he led them to drink. Reaching into his leather pouch, he pulled out a wrapped bundle of cornbread. He broke it in half, offering the larger portion to Mila. "Ain't much, but it'll quiet your stomach." Her fingers trembled as she accepted it. "I'm much obliged, Mr. Boone." She took a small bite, then squared her shoulders. "I want you to know I can work hard. I'll earn my keep and pay back every cent of what you spent today." Stephen's weathered face tightened. "No need for that." He chewed thoughtfully for a moment. "Got a cabin up in the hills. It ain't much, but there's food and shelter. That's all there is to it." The sky deepened to purple as Stephen built a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the creek bank. He handed Mila a thick wool blanket that smelled of pine smoke. She wrapped it around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth, as the night air grew cool. Stephen settled on the other side of the fire, his rifle across his knees as he kept watch. The stars emerged one by one, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Mila's hands clasped together beneath the blanket. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Haven't prayed proper in years, not since Thomas died." She paused, gathering courage. "But I reckon I ought to thank the Lord for sending help when I needed it most." Her soft words of gratitude drifted up with the sparks from the fire. Stephen remained silent, his face unreadable in the flickering light. But his shoulders seemed to tense at the mention of prayer, as if old wounds still burned beneath his quiet exterior. They broke camp at first light, frost crackling beneath their feet. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, the mules picking their way carefully around rocks and fallen timber. By mid-morning, the sun had burned away the last of the valley mist, revealing Stephen's cabin nestled among towering pines. It was a rough-hewn structure, built of thick logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a small shed leaned against the back wall. Stephen helped Mila down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long journey. She followed him to the cabin door, hesitating only briefly before stepping inside. The single room was sparse but tidy. Stacked pelts lined one wall, their rich fur gleaming in the light that filtered through the single window. A narrow bed occupied one corner, its frame made of peeled poles. A crude table and 2 chairs stood near the fireplace, where a black iron pot hung from a swing arm. The walls were bare, except for a few essential tools and a rifle rack. Everything spoke of utility, with little thought given to comfort. But Mila saw possibilities in every corner, her mind already arranging and organizing. She turned to face Stephen, who watched her from the doorway. Drawing herself up to her full height, she spoke with quiet determination. "I'll make this home fit for living." Something flickered in Stephen's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a hint of hope long forgotten. But he only nodded, turning to unload the wagon as Mila began examining her new domain, her practical nature already planning improvements to this solitary mountain refuge. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching dust motes in its beam and illuminating the simple room that would become her new beginning. Though the future remained uncertain, Mila felt the first stirring of purpose since Thomas's death. This lonely cabin needed her as much as she needed it, and that knowledge gave her strength. Dawn crept through the gaps between the cabin logs, painting thin stripes of golden light across Stephen's face. He stirred, then sat up suddenly. An unfamiliar aroma filled the cabin, warm, buttery, and mouth-watering. His stomach growled in response. Mila stood at the crude hearth, her hair already neatly pinned back for the day's work. She had somehow conjured biscuits from the meager supplies in his stores, the golden brown rounds cooling on a clean cloth near the fire. "Morning, Mr. Boone," she said softly, not turning from her task. "Found some flour scraps in the bin." "Weren't much, but it'll do for breakfast." Stephen swung his feet to the floor, still adjusting to the presence of another person in his solitary space. "Ain't had fresh biscuits since." He trailed off, memories of his mother's cooking catching in his throat. "Well, they're ready now," Mila said, filling the awkward silence. She placed 2 biscuits on a tin plate and handed it to him. The warmth seeped through the metal into his calloused hands. After breakfast, Stephen grabbed his axe. "Need more firewood," he said gruffly, heading outside. The familiar rhythm of chopping helped settle his thoughts, the steady thunk of steel against wood echoing through the pine forest. Inside, Mila wasted no time. She found an old broom in the corner and attacked the dusty floor with determination. Years of bachelor living had left their mark, but her strong arms made quick work of it. As she organized the scattered supplies into neat piles, her eye caught something on a high shelf, a leather-bound Bible, its pages worn with age. Carefully, she lifted it down. The cover bore faded gold letters and a date from 20 years past. She placed it gently on the table, arranging it with respect. It looked right there, as if it had been waiting for someone to remember its purpose. When the sun reached its peak, Stephen returned to find the cabin transformed. Sunlight streamed through cleaned windows, and the floor showed its natural wood grain again. He paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Reckon you might teach me about splitting logs," Mila said, breaking the silence. "Can't let you do all the work yourself." Stephen's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Outside, he demonstrated the proper stance, the way to let the axe's weight do the work. Mila watched carefully, then insisted on trying despite his hesitation. Her first few swings went wide, but she persisted. Sweat dampened her collar, and her arms trembled with effort, but she managed to split several pieces before Stephen gently took the axe back. "That's enough for today," he said, his tone softer than before. As evening approached, Mila stirred a pot of stew over the fire. The lamp's glow filled the cabin with warm light, making shadows dance on the freshly swept walls. They ate in comfortable silence until Mila spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "My Thomas, he had land near Blackthorn." She stirred her stew, eyes fixed on the bowl. Nothing much to look at, but there was water rights attached to it. Valuable water rights. She fell silent, leaving the rest unsaid. Stephen listened without comment, but his jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Blackthorn. He'd seen enough of frontier greed to guess at the rest of her story. After supper, Stephen climbed to the cabin's low loft, arranging clean blankets into a pallet. "You can sleep up here," he said, descending the ladder. I'll take the floor below." Mila nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, for everything." In the darkness below, Stephen lay on his bedroll, listening to the familiar night sounds of the mountain. Owl calls, the whisper of wind in pine needles. But now there were new sounds. 2. The soft creak of floorboards above, the rustle of blankets as Mila settled in. He thought about her quiet dignity today, so different from what the jeering crowd had seen. Her determination to work, to make herself useful rather than accept charity. Something about her spirit stirred long-buried memories of his own mother's. Strength. Up in the loft, Mila pulled the blankets close around her shoulders. The fresh pine scent reminded her that she was far from Blackthorn's cruel streets. In the safety of darkness, she whispered a prayer into the quiet night. "Lord, if it's your will, might this finally be a place where I belong?" The cabin settled around them both, its sturdy logs holding the night at bay while the mountain kept its ancient watch outside. Morning frost sparkled on pine needles as Stephen led a spotted mule from the lean-to shelter. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of coming winter. Mila emerged from the cabin wearing one of Stephen's old coats, which hung loose on her frame despite her size. "Traplines need checking," Stephen explained, adjusting the mule's worn leather. "Saddle. Thought you might want to come along, see the territory." Mila eyed the mule uncertainly. "Never rode much before. Old Jake here's steady as they come." Stephen offered his cupped hands as a step. Mila hesitated, then placed her boot in his palms. With a grunt of effort, she swung herself onto the saddle, gripping the horn tightly as the mule shifted beneath. Stephen took the lead rope, guiding them up a narrow trail that wound through stands of aspen. Yellow leaves trembled overhead, a few drifting down to dust Mila's shoulders. Every few minutes, the mule's hoof would slip on loose shale, making Mila gasp and clutch the saddle tighter. "You're doing fine," Stephen assured her, his voice carrying. "Back. Jake knows these trails better than most men." They checked 3 traplines before noon, Stephen showing Mila how to reset the mechanisms without catching fingers in the steel jaws. She listened intently, determined to learn despite her obvious discomfort with the height and movement of riding. Near a crystal-clear stream, movement in the trees caught Stephen's attention. His hand moved to his rifle, then relaxed as a familiar figure emerged. "Henry," Stephen called out in greeting. "Good hunting?" The Ute scout stepped into the clearing, his buckskin clothing blending with the autumn colors. His dark eyes took in Mila's presence with careful consideration. "The deer run high this season," Henry replied in clear English. He inclined his head respectfully toward Mila. "I remember your husband, Thomas Jane. He traded fairly with my people, honored the old agreements about hunting grounds." Mila's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew Thomas?" "He understood the value of respect," Henry said simply. "Few settlers do." They shared dried meat and corn cakes by the stream, Henry speaking of good hunting grounds and Stephen discussing beaver sign. Mila listened, watching how the 2 men communicated with ease born of mutual respect. As they prepared to leave, Henry caught Stephen's eye. "A word, friend?" They stepped away from the stream, out of Mila's earshot. Henry's voice dropped low. "The valley deed your wife's husband filed, it troubles powerful men. Baron McAllister and the rails seek those water rights. While she lives, her claim threatens their plans." His dark eyes held warning. "They will not let such wealth slip away easily." Stephen's jaw tightened. "You're certain?" "As certain as winter follows fall." Henry glanced at Mila, who sat patiently on the mule. "Guard her well, friend. Some men value gold more than honor." The ride back to the cabin was quieter, Stephen's thoughts churning with Henry's warning. As evening approached and supper simmered on the hearth, he knew he had to ask. "Mila," he began carefully, "that land Thomas had, Henry says there were water rights filed?" Mila's hand stilled on the wooden spoon she held. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thomas, knew that valley was special. 3 creeks joined there, enough water to sustain cattle through any drought. She drew a shaky breath. He filed the deed 2 days before the fever took him. By rights, the title should be mine, but she wiped her eyes with her apron. Sheriff, Calloway keeps all such papers. Said a widow had no business holding valuable land. Stephen understood now why the sheriff had been so eager to auction her off. A married woman's property became her husband's by law. They'd hoped to see her wed to someone in their pocket. I never meant to bring trouble to your door, Mela whispered, shame coloring her voice. You've been so kind, and now I've put you in danger too. Stephen crossed the cabin in 3 strides. Look at me, Mela. He waited until she raised her eyes to his. You're not a burden. You're my wife now, and I'll stand with you. His voice carried the weight of mountain stone, immovable and sure. We'll face whatever comes together. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across Mela's tear-streaked face. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt the steel core of her spirit strengthening. She wasn't alone anymore. Dawn painted the sky in soft purple when Stephen led the mule from its shelter. His movements were deliberate as he hitched the animal to their small wagon, checking each leather strap with care. Mela emerged from the cabin wearing her best dress. Faded but clean, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. Ready? Stephen asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wooden seat. Mela nodded, though her fingers trembled as they gripped his calloused palm. The wagon creaked as they settled side by side, and Stephen clicked his tongue, urging the mule forward. They rode in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, the rocky trail gradually giving way to more traveled paths. The sight of blackthorns weathered buildings brought a flutter of anxiety to Mila's chest. Townsfolk stopped to stare as their wagon rolled down the main street, dust rising beneath the wheels. She heard the whispers, saw the pointing fingers. Look who's back, the auction bride. Mountain Man's got himself quite a handful there. Ain't natural, them 2 together. Stephen's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, guiding the mule toward the courthouse. The red brick building loomed before them, its windows gleaming in the morning light. Inside, the clerk's spectacles caught the same glare as he peered down at them from his high desk. Filing papers? The clerk's lip curled. For what purpose? Land claim, Stephen stated firmly. Mrs. Boone's previous property rights need proper recording. The clerk's sneer deepened. Seems to me that matter's already settled. Sheriff Calloway has no legal right to withhold a widow's property papers. Stephen cut in, his voice level but carrying steel. We're here to file proper claim, according to law. A tense silence filled the stuffy office. The clerk's fingers drummed against his desktop, his watery eyes darting between them. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he pulled out the necessary forms. Your responsibility if anything's irregular, he muttered, but reached for his stamp. When Stephen had finished writing, the heavy thunk of official approval echoed through the room. Mela released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They had taken the first step. From the courthouse, they walked the short distance to the white-painted church. Pastor Cooper stood in the doorway, his kind face breaking into a genuine smile at their approach. Mela, Stephen, he greeted warmly, extending both hands. What brings you to town? Filing papers, Pastor, Mela explained softly. For Thomas's land. Understanding filled the pastor's eyes. Come inside a moment. He led them to a quiet pew, sunlight streaming through colored glass. The Lord sees justice done in his time, child. You've found a good man to stand with. You, Mela felt tears threatening. I'm afraid, Pastor. Some powerful folks won't like this. Truth fears no examination, Pastor Cooper assured her. Hold fast to what's right. I'll be praying for you both. Evening shadows were stretching across the street when they finally stopped at the trail's end saloon for a hot meal. The beans were plain but filling, and Mila was grateful for the simple sustenance. Around them, conversations ebbed and flowed, snippets reaching their corner table. Baron McAllister won't take kindly to this. Them water rights is worth a fortune. Whole Valley's future hanging on some woman's claim. Stephen kept his back to the wall, eyes tracking movement through the room. When the drunk rancher approached their table, his boots scuffing against sawdust floors, Stephen's hand dropped casually to his belt. "You two are making a mistake," the man slurred, whiskey heavy on his breath. "Ain't natural, stirring up trouble. 'Bout old claims. Accidents happen to folks who don't know their place." Stephen rose slowly, his height and quiet strength filling the space between them. "Reckon you've had enough to drink, friend. Best head home now." The rancher's bloodshot eyes darted between Stephen's steady gaze and his ready stance. After a tense moment, he backed away, muttering curses. The ride home was darker than their morning journey, the mule picking its way carefully along the trail. Mila sat close to Stephen, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Fear and pride warred in her heart. Fear of the forces aligning against them. Pride in her new husband's unwavering support. When the cabin finally came into view, Stephen helped her down from the wagon. In the starlight, his expression was solemn as he turned to face her. "This ain't just about land," he said plainly. "It's about right and wrong." Mila nodded, then slipped inside while Stephen tended to the mule. In the quiet darkness, she knelt beside their bed and clasped her hands. "Lord," she whispered, "let our cause be just. Give us strength for whatever comes." The mountain cabin settled into a gentle rhythm as summer days stretched long and warm. Each morning, Mila rose before dawn, her strong hands working flour and water into dough while coffee bubbled on the iron stove. The familiar motions brought comfort, kneading, folding, waiting for the bread to rise beneath clean cotton cloths. Outside the cabin window, she'd carved a small garden from the rocky soil. Tender shoots of beans and carrots pushed through the earth, reaching toward sunlight. Stephen had helped her fence it against rabbits, his quiet strength making quick work of the task. While bread baked, Mila sorted through Stephen's worn shirts, examining torn seams and missing buttons. Her needle flashed in the morning light, mending each piece with careful stitches. Sometimes she hummed old hymns as she worked, her voice soft in the peaceful cabin. Stephen spent his days ranging the mountainside, tracking elk through dense pine forests. He always returned by sunset, often with fresh meat or herbs he'd gathered. But today was different. He carried a wooden box under his arm. "Time you learn to protect yourself," he said, setting the box on their rough-hewn table. Inside lay a single-action pistol, well-oiled and maintained. Mila's hands trembled as she lifted it. "I never touched one before. It ain't hard once you know how." Stephen's patience showed as he demonstrated loading, aiming, and the smooth pull of the trigger. They practiced behind the cabin, Mila jumping at each report until her nerves steadied dot as evening settled over the mountains. They shared simple meals by the crackling hearth. Stories flowed easier now, like spring ice breaking. Stephen spoke of winters alone in these hills, tracking wolves through deep snow, reading his mother's Bible by candlelight, watching Aurora dance across star-filled skies. Mila, in turn, shared her own path. How townspeople's cruel words had cut deeper than winter wind. How she'd held her head high even as shame burned inside. How she'd learned to find strength in prayer when all else failed. "You survived," Stephen said softly one evening, stoking the fire. "That takes more courage than most folks know." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. They hitched the mule to their wagon, Mila wearing her freshly pressed dress, Stephen in his cleanest shirt. The ride to town felt different now, less fearful, more purposeful. Blackthorn's little white church sat bathed in morning light. Inside, wooden pews creaked as people settled, some casting uncertain glances at the mountain man and his unconventional wife. Pastor Cooper stood tall in his pulpit, his weathered Bible open before him. "Today we speak of mercy," he began, his warm voice filling the space, "of standing firm in truth when easier paths beckon. The good book tells us God's love lifts up the downtrodden. His justice flows like mighty waters." Mila felt tears prick her eyes, Stephen's solid presence beside her a quiet anchor. After the final hymn faded, several women approached hesitantly. Martha, the baker's wife, spoke first. "That garden patch you mentioned last week, I have some spare seedlings if you'd like." Sarah, who ran the general store, added, "And I found extra fabric that might suit you, Mila. You've shown such spirit, making a real home up there." The simple kindness overwhelmed her. On the wagon ride home, tears flowed freely down Mila's cheeks. "I never thought," she whispered, "never dreamed anyone would show me kindness again. Thought I'd always be the woman they mocked at auction." Stephen's calloused hand covered hers on the wagon seat. "You're more than what they said. Always were." That evening, they sat close at the table, Stephen's mother's Bible open between them. Lamplight cast warm shadows as they took turns reading verses. Aloud, Stephen's deep voice stumbled sometimes over the words, but Mila never corrected him. Her own voice grew stronger with each passage. Watching her finger trace the lines, Stephen realized something had shifted inside him. The solitude he'd wrapped around himself like a protective blanket for so many years now felt empty without her presence. The cabin's quiet spaces had transformed from lonely to peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of shared life, bread baking, needle pulling thread, prayers whispered in darkness. Mila closed the Bible gently, her hand lingering on its worn cover. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt rooted, part of something lasting, not just surviving, but building a life. Stephen's strength and faith had given her shelter, but her own courage had helped make it home. They sat in comfortable silence as the lamp burned low, two souls no longer alone on the mountain. A week passed like water flowing over stones, each day bringing the mountain air closer to autumn's chill. The morning peace shattered when Henry's horse thundered up the trail, dust rising behind his urgent approach. Stephen met him at the cabin door while Mila paused in her bread making, flour dusting her hands. Henry dismounted in one fluid motion, his face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Bad wind's coming, friend," he said, gripping Stephen's shoulder. "Railroad men gather in town like crows before storm. Baron McAllister hired guns, mean ones from down Texas way." Mila's hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron. "They mean to take the valley?" Henry nodded, his dark eyes solemn. "They speak of burning out settlers who won't sell. Your claim threatens their plans for the railroad's water needs." He gestured toward the surrounding forest. "Must prepare. Make strong walls, store food. Winter comes early to mountains." Stephen's jaw tightened as he surveyed their home. "Reckon you're right, Henry. Much obliged for the warning." They worked through the day, 3 sets of hands moving with purpose. Stephen and Henry reinforced the cabin walls with extra logs, while Mila packed away dried meat and beans in the root cellar. The steady thud of axes marked their progress as they built up the defensive positions around the cabin. "Stack boxes here," Stephen directed, pointing behind the front window. "Good cover if shooting starts." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held worry when they fell on Mila. Henry helped them position rifles at key points, showing Mila how to reload quickly. "Remember what Stephen taught you," he said kindly. "Steady hands make true shots." As dusk approached, Henry mounted his horse to leave. "I will watch the trails," he promised. "If they come, you will have warning." After he rode away, Stephen turned to Mila. "Walk with me?" he asked softly. She nodded, and they made their way down to the creek where they had first camped together. The water burbled over rocks, peaceful against the weight of their thoughts. Mila stopped, her hands clasped tight. "Stephen, I never meant to bring such trouble to your door. You took me and showed me kindness, and now," her voice caught, "now I might be the cause of your ruin." Stephen turned to her, his weathered face gentle in the fading light. "What's ruin to a man who's been alone too long?" His calloused hand found hers. "With you, I've something worth fighting for. First time in years I feel alive again, feel purpose." Tears spilled down Mila's cheeks as she squeezed his hand. They stood together, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. When they returned to the cabin, something dark caught Stephen's eye. A piece of paper had been nailed to their door while they were gone. He ripped it free, reading the crude words by the last light of day, "Leave or burn." Mila's breath hitched as she read over his shoulder. Fear crawled up her spine, but beneath it, something stronger took root. "I won't run," she said firmly. "This is our home now. God led me here to you, and I aim to stay." Stephen's eyes met hers, pride and determination mingling in his gaze. Without a word, he strode to the fireplace and tossed the note into the flames. They watched it curl and blacken, the threat turning to ash. "We stand," he said simply, "together." Mila knelt beside the hearth, her hands clasped in prayer. Stephen lowered himself next to her, his own head bowing. Her voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke. "Lord, protect this home and the love that fills it. Give us strength to face what comes. Guide our hearts toward justice, not vengeance. Keep us safe through the night." As if in answer to her words, wolves began to howl in the distance. The sound echoed off the mountainsides, wild and mournful, carrying hints of the danger drawing ever closer to their door. Stephen's arm wrapped around Mila's shoulders as they listened. Two souls united against the gathering storm. The fire crackled, casting warm light through the cabin they had made their own. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it standing, side by side, their faith and love a shield against the darkness. Morning came too soon, the sun barely cresting the eastern ridge when Mila touched Stephen's arm. "We need supplies," she said firmly, "and I aim to check on our claim papers." Stephen studied her face, seeing determination replace the fear from last night. "Might be safer if you stay here. Together," she reminded him of their promise. "Besides, I won't hide while they try to steal what's rightfully ours." They hitched the mule to their small wagon and set out as dawn painted the sky pink. The morning air held autumn's bite, and Mila pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. As they descended from the mountain, smoke caught their attention, dark pillars rising from the valley floor. "Lord have mercy," Mila whispered as they passed the first scorched field. Blackened fence posts stood like grave markers over charred earth. Another homestead ahead showed similar signs of raiding burned hay bales and a ransacked barn. Stephen's hands tightened on the reins, trying to scare folks into selling cheap. "Or running," Mila added softly, her heart aching for the families who had lost so much. Blackthorn streets were quieter than usual when they arrived, townsfolk hurrying about their business with worried glances over their shoulders. Stephen helped Mila down from the wagon, his hand lingering protectively at her elbow. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Calloway lounged behind his desk, boots propped up, a malicious smile playing at his lips. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man and his prize cow," he drawled. Stephen stepped forward, but Mila's hand on his arm held him back. "We're here about our claim papers," she said, her voice steady despite the insult. "Papers?" The sheriff made a show of rifling through his desk. "Seems they've been misplaced. Terrible shame, that. Might take weeks to sort out if they turn up at all." "You know that's not true," Stephen growled. The sheriff stood, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Careful now. Wouldn't want to have to lock up a man for threatening an officer of the law." Mila stepped forward, drawing herself up to her full height. "I will not be silenced," she declared, her voice ringing through the office. "God sees your corruption, Sheriff Calloway, and so do honest folk. You can hide papers, but you cannot hide truth. Is that so?" A heavy footstep in the doorway made them turn. Pastor Cooper stood there, his Bible tucked under one arm, eyes sharp with righteous anger. "Indeed it is," the pastor said. "And I'll gladly testify to any court about what I've witnessed in this town. The Lord's justice may be patient, Sheriff, but it is certain." The sheriff's face darkened, but he couldn't dismiss the pastor's moral authority so easily. "Get out," he spat, "all of you." Outside, Pastor Cooper laid a gentle hand on Mella's shoulder. "You'll stay with us tonight. Sarah's making beef stew, and it's not safe on the mountain after dark." The parsonage was small but warm, filled with the aroma of cooking and the laughter of Cooper's children. Sarah Cooper, a small woman with kind eyes, welcomed them like family. After supper, while Stephen discussed strategy with the pastor, Mila helped Sarah with the dishes. "You're braver than you know," Sarah said softly, passing Mila a plate to dry. "Standing up to them like that, it gives others courage too." Mila's hand stilled on the dish towel. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I'm more scared of letting evil win by staying quiet." They set out at first light the next morning, Pastor Cooper's prayers following them up the mountain. Stephen drove carefully, watching for ambush, but the trail remained clear. When they reached the cabin, however, fresh hoofprints circled the building. At least 3 horses had been there during the night. Stephen drew his rifle, checking each room while Milo waited by the wagon. "Nothing stolen," he called finally. "But come see this." Inside, their few possessions were untouched, except for one thing. Stephen's mother's Bible lay torn on the floor, its pages scattered like fallen leaves. Mila knelt beside it, gathering the precious pages with trembling hands. "They want to break us," she whispered, cradling the damaged book to her chest. Tears threatened, but she held them back, anger replacing fear. Stephen knelt beside her, his rough fingers gentle as they touched the torn leather cover. "Then we won't bend," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We'll repair it, same as we'll repair everything else they try to destroy." Mila looked up at him, seeing in his eyes the same resolve she felt in her heart. Together, they began collecting the scattered pages, their hands meeting over words of faith that no amount of hatred could truly destroy. 3 days after the Bible incident, hoofbeats echoed through the morning mist. Stephen reached for his rifle, before recognizing Henry's distinctive whistle. The Ute scout dismounted gracefully, his face grave as he pulled documents from his saddlebag. "Found a friend at agency office," Henry said, spreading papers on the rough-hewn table. "Clerk keeps duplicate records. Your deed still lives, but others watch it like hawks." Mila's hands trembled as she touched the copied documents. "My husband's signature," she whispered, clear as day. Stephen studied the papers, his jaw set. "Won't matter if they steal or destroy these two. We need to get them before a proper judge, away from Blackthorn's corruption." "County seat," Henry nodded. 2 days' ride east. "But tonight," he glanced out the window at gathering clouds. "Tonight, watch close." They spent the afternoon preparing Stephen, cleaning his rifle, Mila packing supplies they'd need for court. The sun set early behind heavy clouds, and darkness crept across the valley like spilled ink. The attack came near midnight. The first shot shattered their lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. Stephen rolled from his chair, pushing Mila toward the back wall. More bullets splintered the window frame. Behind the woodpile, Stephen commanded, returning fire through the broken window. Outside, horses whinnied in panic. A familiar whistle cut through the chaos. Henry, firing from the shadows of the pine grove. "The barn!" Mila's cry drew Stephen's attention to orange, flames licking up the wooden walls. A thrown lantern had caught in the hay, and fire spread rapidly through the dry fodder. "Stay down," Stephen ordered, but Mila was already moving. She grabbed 2 water pails and ran for the creek, her nightdress ghostly in the moonlight. Bullets kicked dirt at her feet, but she didn't flinch. Henry's voice rang out in Ute, then English. "Riders coming. More friends." The raiders, hearing reinforcements approach, wheeled their horses around. Final shots echoed through the trees. As they fled, leaving destruction in their wake, Mila passed full buckets hand to hand with Stephen, fighting the barn fire. Henry joined them, but it was too late to save the structure. They could only prevent the flames from spreading to the cabin or forest. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. Years of stored supplies reduced to ash. Dawn found them exhausted. Clothes and faces streaked with soot. The morning light revealed the battle's toll. Bullet holes riddled the cabin walls. The barn was a smoking ruin, and trampled earth showed where their enemies had circled. Stephen sagged against the cabin wall, his voice rough with smoke and regret. "I'm sorry, Mila. Never meant to bring such danger to your door." Mila stepped close, her strong hands framing his face. Ash smudged her cheeks, but her eyes blazed with determination. "I chose this," she said firmly. "Chose you. Chose to stand. For what's right. Don't you dare apologize for giving me that chance." Stephen pulled her close, their hearts beating in time beneath the lightning sky. Henry watched from the creek bank, nodding in approval at their unity. "We leave for court today," Stephen decided. "Before they come back stronger." They worked quickly, salvaging what they could from the barn's ashes. Mila changed into her best dress, carefully folding their precious documents and securing them beneath her petticoats. Stephen hitched their faithful mule to the wagon while Henry scouted the trail ahead. "Clear path east," Henry reported, returning. "I ride with you to Valley Edge. Others watch the high ground." Mila climbed onto the wagon seat, her spine straight despite the sleepless night. The rising sun caught golden glints in her soot-dusted hair. Stephen took the reins, his shoulder pressing reassuringly against hers. "Ready?" he asked softly. Mila patted the hidden papers beneath her skirts. "Ready," she answered, her voice steady. "God didn't bring us this far to fail now." The wagon creaked into motion, Henry riding guard beside them. Behind them, thin smoke still rose from the barn's remains, not a symbol of defeat, but of their determination to seek justice through law rather than violence. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and promise as they began their journey to the county seat, where truth would finally have its day in court. Rain drummed steadily on the wagon's canvas cover as Stephen guided their mule along the muddy trail. The autumn storms had settled in, turning their journey into a test of endurance. Mila huddled beneath a woolen blanket, watching raindrops trickle down the tarp's edges. "Hold steady," she called as the wagon hit another rut. Stephen winced, his bruised ribs protesting the jolt. The raiders' attack had left its mark on him, though he tried to hide it. When they stopped to make camp that first evening, Mila insisted on tending to his injuries. "Let me see," she said firmly, helping him remove his sodden shirt. Purple bruises mottled his side where he'd fallen during the gunfight. Stephen sat quietly as she wrapped clean strips of cloth around his ribs, her touch gentle but sure. "Not my first bruises," he said gruffly, but gratitude softened his voice. "No," Mila agreed, tucking the bandage end secure. "But maybe the first time someone's here to tend them." They slept fitfully that night under hastily strung tarps, the steady patter of rain their constant companion. Dawn brought no relief from the weather, but they pressed on, knowing each mile put distance between them and their enemies. By the second evening, they found a relatively dry spot beneath a stand of towering pines. Stephen managed to get a small fire going, and Mila brewed coffee in their dented tin pot. The familiar aroma rose with the wood smoke, bringing a touch of comfort to their wet camp. Stephen accepted the steaming cup she offered, their fingers brushing. He stared into the flames, seeming to wrestle with his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Never figured on God sending me a wife, he admitted quietly. Spent so many years alone, I thought that's all there was for me. Mila's hands trembled around her own cup. And I never thought, she paused, gathering courage. Never thought any man would stand up for my dignity the way you did. Most folk just saw my size and decided I deserved their mockery. They were wrong, Stephen said firmly. His calloused hand found hers in the firelight. Dead wrong. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled around their camp, the fire's glow creating a small circle of warmth against the damp night. Even the rain seemed to soften, becoming a gentle backdrop to their shared peace. The next afternoon, their persistence was rewarded. Cresting a ridge, they caught their first glimpse of the county seat spread out below them. The courthouse stood, proud in the center of town, its red brick walls a stark contrast to the wooden buildings flanking it. Saloons and hotels lined the muddy main street, their signs competing for attention. There it is, Stephen said, relief evident in his voice. Journey's almost done. Mila clutched the documents hidden beneath her dress, her heart pounding. After so many miles, so much fear and hope, they were finally here. They entered town quietly, drawing little notice from the busy streets. Stephen guided their wagon to a modest boarding house on a side street, its clean windows and neat flower boxes speaking of careful maintenance. The proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Henderson, welcomed them with understanding in her eyes. You look like you could use a hot meal and dry beds, she said, taking in their road-worn appearance. I've got a room upstairs, if you don't mind climbing a few stairs. That evening, in their simple but clean room, Mila knelt beside the narrow bed. Her nightdress was patched but fresh, her hair still damp from washing away the road's dust. In the lamplight, she bowed her head in prayer. Lord, she whispered, give us strength for tomorrow. Let truth prevail in that courthouse. And thank you for sending Stephen to save me when I thought I was beyond saving. Stephen, sitting in the room's sole chair, watched her quiet devotion. Something stirred in his heart, not just admiration for her courage, but a deeper appreciation for the faith that sustained her. Through mockery, loss, and now danger, she had kept that flame of belief burning. The lamp's gentle glow cast her shadow on the wall, and Stephen found himself seeing not the woman others had ridiculed, but a soul of remarkable strength. Tomorrow they would face whatever the courthouse held, but tonight, in this quiet room, he knew with certainty that God had sent him not just a wife, but a partner in life's hardest battles. Dawn painted the courthouse steps in pale gold as Stephen and Mila climbed toward the heavy wooden doors. The morning air held an autumn chill, making Mila draw her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Their footsteps echoed in the marble hallway as they entered, finding seats on worn wooden benches. Within minutes, the opposition arrived in force. Baron McAllister strode in, flanked by 3 expensive-looking lawyers in fine suits. Behind them came a cluster of hired men, their gun belts prominent beneath their coats. They filled the opposite side of the courtroom, their glares burning holes in Mila's back. All rise, the bailiff called as Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. The judge's weathered face betrayed nothing as he took his seat, adjusting his spectacles while reviewing the papers before him. Sheriff Calloway testified first, his usual sneer barely hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. The woman never had proper claim, he declared, pointing at Mila. Her husband's supposed filings were irregular. No legal standing at all. Mila's hands twisted in her lap, but when her name was called, she rose with dignity. Stephen watched her walk to the front, saw her shoulders straighten as she faced the court. My husband filed those water rights proper and legal, she stated, her voice growing stronger with each word. 3 witnesses signed the documents. He paid the fees in full. The deed is mine by right of marriage and inheritance. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Baron McAllister's face darkened as he whispered urgently to his lawyers. One rose to cross-examine her, trying to twist her words, but Mila held firm. Pastor Cooper came forward next, his Bible tucked under one arm. "I witnessed Thomas Jane's filing myself," he testified. "Signed my name right there on the paper. He wanted to ensure his wife would have security if anything happened to him." Henry followed, standing tall despite the hostile stares. "The Ute people remember Thomas Jane as an honest man," he stated clearly. "He marked his boundaries fair, respected the old agreements. His widow deserves the same respect." The turning point came when Pastor Cooper produced copies of the original documents, papers he had wisely duplicated years ago. Laid beside the sheriff's versions, the forgeries became obvious. Dates had been altered, signatures changed. Judge Harrison leaned forward, examining the papers through his spectacles. The sheriff's face had gone pale, while Baron McAllister's turned an alarming shade of red. "This court will adjourn for deliberation," the judge announced, rising. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning for the verdict." The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife as everyone filed out. Stephen kept his hand at Mila's back, guiding her through the crowd. They had almost reached the street when one of McAllister's men shouldered roughly past Stephen. "Ain't smart to push this further," the gunman growled, his hand resting meaningfully on his weapon. "Accidents happen on mountain trails." Stephen drew Mila closer, feeling her tremble against him. "We've come too far to turn back," he whispered in her ear. "Whatever comes, we face it together." They made their way back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house through streets that seemed colder and more hostile than before. In their room, Mila insisted on preparing supper, though Stephen could see her hands shaking as she sliced bread and stirred the stew she had started that morning. "Keeps my mind busy," she explained, managing a weak smile. "Better than sitting and fretting." Stephen watched her work, noting how she squared her shoulders against her fear. When she set the bowls on the small table, he surprised them both by reaching for her hand and bowing his head. The silence stretched for a long moment before he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord, you gave me this woman to protect. Help me be worthy of that trust, and help justice be done tomorrow." Mila's fingers tightened around his, a tear sliding down her cheek. They ate their simple meal in quiet companionship, each lost in thoughts of what the morning might bring. Outside their window, the sun set behind the courthouse, its shadow stretching long across the town like a finger of judgment pointing toward dawn. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows. As Judge Harrison took his seat, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on his stern face. Mila sat rigid beside Stephen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Having reviewed all evidence presented, the judge began, his voice carrying to every corner. "This court finds the original deed and water rights filed by Thomas Jane to be lawful and binding." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Furthermore, these rights transferred legally to his widow, Mila Jane, now Mila Boone. The altered documents presented by Sheriff Calloway are hereby declared fraudulent." The courtroom erupted. Baron McAllister slammed his fist on the table, his face purple with rage. His lawyers scrambled to their feet, shouting objections. But Judge Harrison's gavel crashed down. "Order," he thundered. "The law is clear. This deed belongs to Mrs. Boone. Any further interference with her property rights will be met with the full force of the law." Tears streamed down Mila's cheeks as she gripped Stephen's hand. He squeezed back, his throat tight with emotion. Henry, standing nearby, nodded in quiet satisfaction. Baron McAllister shoved past his lawyers, pointing a trembling finger at Mela and Stephen. "This isn't over," he snarled. "No mountain trash will steal what's rightfully mine." He stormed out, his men following like dark shadows. They waited until the courthouse cleared before stepping into the street. The autumn air felt crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke. Stephen kept Mila close as they walked, Henry trailing watchfully behind them. They had barely gone 50 paces when movement caught Stephen's eye. Gunmen emerged from the alley ahead, weapons drawn. More appeared behind them, cutting off retreat. "That's far enough," one called, his revolver aimed at Stephen's chest. Stephen pushed Mila behind him, his hand moving to his own weapon. Henry's rifle appeared as if by magic, covering their backs. The street went deadly quiet. "You heard the judge," Stephen said firmly. "The law is decided." "Law don't matter out here," another gunman sneered. "Baron McAllister wants you gone." Townsfolk began gathering at the edges of the street, watching. Pastor Cooper stepped forward from the crowd, then another man, and another. Soon a dozen locals stood behind Stephen and Mila. "This ain't right," Cooper declared. "We've watched too long while honest folks got bullied." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Then one of McAllister's men twitched, his gun barking. Stephen felt fire slash across his shoulder as he drew and fired back. The street exploded in gunfire. Through the chaos came Judge Harrison's voice. "Drop those weapons." He stood on the courthouse steps, rifle leveled at Sheriff Calloway, who had been trying to slip behind Stephen with his gun drawn. The sheriff froze, then slowly raised his hands. His badge glinted as it fell in the dust. Two deputies, shamefaced, stepped forward to take him into custody, seeing their leaders captured or fled. The remaining gunmen lowered their weapons. The fight drained from the street like water, leaving only the bitter taste of powder smoke. "You're bleeding," Mila gasped, touching Stephen's shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. "Just a scratch," he assured her, though the wound burned fierce. They made their way back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, where Mila insisted on treating his injury. In their room, she helped him remove his shirt, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the wound with water and whiskey. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, voice breaking as she wrapped clean bandages around his shoulder. Stephen caught her hand, drawing her close. "You never will," he replied hoarsely. Their eyes met, years of loneliness dissolving in that quiet moment. Through the window came the sounds of the town returning to normal. Wagon wheels, children's voices, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. But something had changed. The people had finally stood against the corruption that had poisoned a community for so long. Henry appeared at their door as evening fell, bringing news that the sheriff was locked in his own jail. Baron McAllister and his men had fled toward the railroad towns, but the judge had already telegraphed warnings to law officers there. "The people remember their courage now," Henry said with a slight smile. "This valley will be different." Mila served coffee, her movements sure and peaceful despite the day's violence. She had won more than land and water rights. She had won her place in the world, earned by her own quiet strength. As darkness settled over the town, she sat beside Stephen, carefully checking his bandages one more time. The warmth of her presence beside him felt right, like coming home after a long, cold journey. The autumn sun painted long shadows across the valley as Stephen and Mila's wagon rolled toward home. After days on the road from the county seat, the sight of their cabin stirred deep emotion. The scorched barn stood like a blackened skeleton against the mountains, yet the main house remained intact, a testament to their determination. Henry rode out to meet them, his horse kicking up dust. "Welcome home," he called, raising a hand in greeting. Behind him, several wagons approached, neighbors Stephen barely knew, coming to help rebuild. Mila's eyes widened at the sight. "I never expected," she whispered, gripping Stephen's arm. The valley buzzed with activity as folks set to work. Men hauled fresh-cut timber while women organized supplies. Pastor Cooper and his wife arrived with a wagon piled high with necessities: flour, salt, seeds, and fresh quilts sewn by the church ladies. The same women who had once turned away now pressed preserves and baked goods into Mila's hands. "We were wrong before," Mrs. Peterson admitted, her weathered face sincere. "You've shown us what real courage looks like." Tears welled in Mila's eyes as she accepted their gifts. Stephen watched from where he worked, his heart swelling at how the community had transformed their view of his wife. The barn raising took shape through the day. Henry directed the work with quiet efficiency, showing others how to notch logs properly. Stephen's shoulder still ached from the gunshot wound, but he worked steadily alongside the others, touched by their willingness to help. "Never thought I'd see the day," Henry remarked privately to Stephen. "These settlers finally learning to stand together." By late afternoon, the new barn's framework reached toward the sky. Women had swept the cabin clean and hung fresh curtains at the windows. The garden, though trampled during the raid, had been cleared and prepared for new planting. As sunset approached, everyone gathered in and around the cabin for a celebration supper. Lanterns cast a warm glow as folks squeezed inside, sharing benches and leaning against walls. The aroma of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Stephen stood, his voice rough with emotion. "Mila and I thank you all," he began, looking around at the gathered faces. "This cabin ain't just ours anymore. From now on, our door stays open to any widow, orphan, or traveler needing shelter." He paused, meeting Mala's gaze. "This valley's seen enough hardship. Time it became a sanctuary instead." Mila beamed up at him, tears shining in her eyes. The crowd murmured approval, and someone started humming a hymn. Soon the cabin filled with music, voices rising in harmony as they sang Amazing Grace. The evening stretched on with stories and laughter. Children played in the yard while older folk shared tales of early days in the valley. Even Henry joined in, teaching young ones how to count in Ute while their parents listened respectfully. As the stars emerged, guests began heading home by wagon and horseback. Promises to return and help finish the barn rang through the cooling air. Stephen and Mila stood on their porch, waving goodbye until the last lantern disappeared into the darkness. They lingered outside, watching stars pierce the velvet sky. The night air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Stephen wrapped an arm around Mila's waist, drawing her close. "Remember that day in Blackthorn?" he murmured. "When I bid triple the going price?" Mila nodded against his shoulder. "Still the cheapest bargain of my life," he said softly. She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "And I was the one bought free," she whispered. Their gazes held, years of loneliness melting away in the quiet moment. Around them, the valley lay peaceful, no longer a place of shame and struggle, but a sanctuary where hope had finally taken root. Winter settled over the valley like a gentle blanket, snowflakes drifting silently past the cabin windows. Inside, warmth radiated from the stone fireplace, and the sweet scent of pine logs mingled with the aroma of simmering stew. The cabin, once stark and lonely, now buzzed with life and purpose. Stephen sat in his hand-carved chair by the fire, wood shavings curling at his feet as he carefully shaped a small wooden horse. 3 more toys, a bear, a deer, and a rabbit, already stood finished on the table beside him. His weathered hands moved with surprising gentleness over the wood, each stroke of the knife deliberate and sure. Mila stirred the iron pot hanging over the fire, adding another pinch of dried herbs to the thick stew. Her gaze drifted fondly to the 2 orphan children playing quietly in the corner, Sarah, aged 8, and Timothy, aged 6. They had arrived last week, brought by a worried neighbor after their parents' wagon accident. "Smells mighty fine," Stephen commented, testing the horse's leg for smoothness. Before Mila could respond, a knock echoed through the cabin. The door opened to reveal Pastor Cooper, snow dusting his broad shoulders. "Evening, folks," he called cheerfully, stamping his boots. "Thought we might share some carols before the storm sets in proper." The children scrambled up excitedly as Mila welcomed him in. Soon, the cabin filled with the sound of silent night, the pastor's deep voice leading while Mila's clear tones harmonized above. Even Stephen, who once shunned such gatherings, hummed along softly as he worked. The window, they spotted Henry approaching on horseback. The Ute scout entered quietly, bringing news that warmed them more than the fire. The corrupt barons who had threatened them had lost their grip on the territory. Their schemes exposed, their allies had abandoned them one by one. "The valley is at peace now," Henry said, "except in a bowl of stew from Mila. Your stand for justice changed more than just your lives." After supper, Mila guided sleepy Timothy up to the loft where fresh quilts awaited. "Tell me the story again," he murmured, as she tucked him in beside Sarah. "About how Mr. Stephen saved you." "That's a tale for another night," Mila whispered, kissing his forehead. "Sleep now, little one." Returning downstairs, she found Pastor Cooper and Henry had departed, leaving her alone with Stephen by the fire. She settled beside him on the bench, her shoulder touching his. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as snow whispered against the windows. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed," Mila said softly. "From that awful day in Blackthorn to this, a real home filled with love." Stephen set aside his carving and took her hand. "The townsfolk who mocked now looked to you with respect," he said. "You showed them what true strength looks like." "We both did," Mila corrected gently. "God had a purpose in bringing us together, though we couldn't see it then." They sat quietly for a moment, listening to the children's soft breathing from above and the crackle of the fire. Then, as naturally as breathing, they bowed their heads together. "Thank you, Lord," Mila prayed, her voice thick with emotion, "for your mercy that makes all things new, for bringing love from loneliness and hope from despair." "Amen," Stephen whispered, squeezing her hand. Outside, snow continued to fall in. The darkness but the cabin's windows glowed warm and bright, a beacon of welcome in the vast frontier night. Inside, where once there had been emptiness, now dwelt a family bound by love, faith, and the courage to stand for what was right. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.